Okay, hi guys, how's it going? So I just wanted to do a quick video on lenses for gimbals. Now this isn't necessarily going to be sort of an all-encompassing video, it's nothing like that at all. It's just a couple of lens options for you to consider compared side by side. So if you've got a Sony mirrorless camera and you use it for a video a lot, you're probably going to want a gimbal, and you're going to want a lens which works well on that gimbal. Now, one of the suggestions that I'm going to put forward to you will only really work for APS-C cameras or cameras that work well in APS-C mode. I'm using the A7 Mark III, which is a brilliant camera, and it works really well in the APS-C mode, and it works really well full frame. Some of the cameras, like A7S II, things like that, they don't work very well in the crop mode. It's a lower megapixel camera, so you kind of need to use the full sensor if you want to get decent 4K out of it. It can do it, but it's not as good. For other cameras like the A7R II, that actually works better in the crop mode than what it does on the full frame when it comes to the video 4K. And obviously if you've got an APS-C Sony mirrorless camera, then it's going to work well for that. So anyway, before I waffle on any further, have a quick look at these two clips. So one of these is with a very cheap lens, around about the sort of £150, £200 mark, and then one of them is with a lens that's worth roughly around about £1,000 mark. You can get them from between sort of £750 up to about £1,100, depending on whether you're buying it secondhand or where you get it. But anyway, have a quick look. So again, one of these is with a very cheap lens, and one of these is with a very relatively expensive lens. Have a quick look at these two, compare them side by side, and then we'll move on and I'll explain what was what.
Okay, go on then. Just whatever you do now, we'll do the same next time. Too fast. It's difficult to walk backwards.
Don't crush it. Really crush the
Don't crash my hand drone. Okay, and then we'll swap lenses, do that again. Go. I should use this thing more often. It is pretty good, isn't it, for the money?
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that those two lenses, there is one that's got a bit of an edge, but essentially, if you're watching it full screen with a 4K monitor, you'll probably notice there's not a huge amount in it between those two. The field of view is pretty much identical. The sharpness, one's got a slight edge on sharpness, I'm not going to lie to you, but they're surprisingly similar considering how different price points they are. So what two lenses you just saw there was the ZEISS Batis 18mm 2.8, which is a full frame lens, and it's a gorgeous lens. And these these are around about £1,000, a bit more. You can get them for about £750 second hand, but they sell very easily for £800. So this is not a cheap lens by any stretch of the imagination. It's a great lens in my opinion for a gimbal because it's quite light, it's not too big, and it's 18mm full frame. It's got a nice wide angle view, which obviously makes your depth of field deeper, and just generally makes gimbal work easier if you've got a wider lens. I mean, some people argue that you might want to have a medium view, or you may even want to have a long lens on a gimbal. Depends what gimbal you've got and what work you're doing. But for my money, generally wider angle lenses make more sense for showing the location, showing sort of like showing more basically, and having that deeper depth of field. Anyway, so that was the expensive one. And the other option, which may surprise you, this is my cheap one, that I'll say is really not probably a better option than what you might actually think. And it was the 16mm Pancake lens, which is an old, really cheap lens. You can get these for about £70. These are really, really cheap, with the ultra wide converter stuck on the front of it, which basically gives you a, so this is a 1.75 expanded view. So if you stick your camera in APS-C mode, you put the 16mm on, and you do the maths with the 0.75, it basically gives you an exactly the same field of view as 18mm on full frame. So, I mean, obviously, we're not talking about photography here, we're talking about for video, we're talking about, 4K video, ideally with the aperture somewhere in the middle, like f8, that kind of thing. Both of those clips you just saw, they're both with f8. This one in the full frame mode, this one in the APS-C mode on the Sony. And as you can see, the field of view is pretty much identical. The maths works out that they're pretty much bang on identical, as long as one of them's in the crop mode. And yeah, so I really think this is not a bad option. So downsides are, it does start to soften up around the edges, certainly as soon as you start to open up the aperture. Here's some photographs to gives you a clear side-by-side of, the image detail you're going to be getting out of this. It does, the optics are not as good as this lens. I'm not going to say it is, but if you've got it at f8 or somewhere in the middle, and you've got plenty of light, and you're not shooting in the middle of the night, and you need a wide open aperture, f8 on both of these, one in APS-C mode and one in full frame mode for your 4K video, and you're not comparing photos with the extra megapixel that you would get, is actually not a huge amount in it. There really isn't. They're very, very, very similar in those situations, and those are the situations that you would be using them on the gimbal. Pluses, this is a little bit lighter than this one here. I'll quickly weigh it and put the stats on the screen for you in a minute. But also the little Pancake lens with the ultra wide converter, it's a bit shorter, so it's a little bit less nose heavy on the gimbal. And it's generally just a bit smaller. It's generally sort of a smaller little compact unit. So there you go. So that was my suggestion. I'm not going to say it's the best lens ever, because it has some failings. The autofocus is terrible. It has horrible sort of breathing autofocus. I would only ever use it in, I'd set my focus to manual, and I'd set my focus, set aperture, and do everything like that, and then run off with it. To be honest with you, I would kind of do that with any lens, because I'm not a big autofocus fan. Even on a gimbal, I'd still prefer to set my focus in advance. So there's going to be some people that rely on autofocus a lot. Do not use this kind of lens for autofocus. It's got horrible sort of like pulsating focus breathing, which looks terrible, and it's obviously going to not focus that well as well, because it's a very, very clunky basic lens. The ZEISS Batis will autofocus much, much better, much smoother. But generally, at 18mm on a full frame, it's still a very, very wide, a wide field of view with a deep depth of field. Even at 2.8, you can blur out the backgrounds, but you have to be quite close to your subject to do that. Generally, with that wider lens, you've got a very, very deep field of view most of the time anyway, especially around about the sort of, f5.6 up to f16. You've got really, really deep depth of field, so the focus, in my opinion, isn't as important. So anyway, so there you go, guys. That was my little sort of my little talk about that. I'm not going to say it's the best lens in the world, but if you want a cheap lens which does a pretty damn good job on a gimbal, then that's really not a bad option. It's small, it's light, like I said, as long as your camera does a pretty good job in APS-C mode, then this gives you a nice wide angle, and it's actually not as bad as you might expect. So possibly give it a try. Obviously the Batis is a superior lens in many, many ways optically, but it does cost pretty much 5 times as much, and it's bigger and a bit bulkier. But it depends what you want. If you're going out at night time and you want a lens that's going to work well at 2.8, you're going to want this. If you're going to want a lens that you're going to be using for photography as well, which works on the full frame, on your full frame camera, you're going to want this one. But if you just want a lens to pop on your Sony for gimbal work in APS-C mode, this is really not a bad option for such a cheap price. So anyway guys, enough waffle. I just thought I'd put that out there as an option for you to consider, and then give you a couple of examples. Here's a bunch of shots so you can see exactly what they look like at 2.8, f5.6, f8 and f16, side by side with a very, very optically superior lens. Remember, one's in APS-C mode and one's full frame mode, so you know there's a few difficulties in my comparison, but either way, when one's in APS-C mode and one's in full frame mode, the field of view is identical. So you know, they're very different, but they're also, in my opinion, worth comparing. So I thought I'd do the comparison and share it with you guys. Anyway guys, I hope that was useful. I'll leave that there, and yeah, maybe give it a go. You know, for 150 quid on eBay, and there's loads of them out there, it's worth a punt. It is worth a punt. Certainly not a sexy lens, but for a very light, easy to use little gimbal lens, it's not that bad. So consider it. Okay guys, peace out. Hope that's useful. Bye.